My stepdaughter told me that the greatest gift I could give her for her luxury wedding was my absolute absence. She looked me dead in the eye and said I was not her real dad, I was just Robert. My wife of 20 years sat right next to her, slowly sipping her chilled white wine, and stayed completely silent. So I did exactly what they asked. But before I vanished into thin air, after I legally sold the house right out from under them, and permanently canceled every single exorbitant wedding expense, the single manila folder I left sitting on the pristine marble island of our empty kitchen shocked them to their absolute core. Before I tell you exactly how I dismantled their perfect little world, let me know what city you are listening from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you have ever had to quietly cut toxic family members out of your life to protect your own peace. It was a Tuesday evening when the structural foundation of my entire life cracked and gave way. I am Robert, 71 years old, a retired structural engineer who spent 40 years building commercial bridges and 20 years pouring my blood, sweat, and savings into trying to build a loving family. I was sitting in my own living room, resting in my favorite leather armchair after a long day of doing yard work. The house was quiet until my 27-year-old stepdaughter Brittany marched in, followed closely by her fiancé Chad. Chad was a 29-year-old failed tech entrepreneur who always smelled like expensive cologne and borrowed money. Brittany slammed a thick, glossy binder onto the mahogany coffee table in front of me. It was her wedding budget spreadsheet. I had already agreed to pay for the wedding, setting aside a generous $45,000 to ensure she had a beautiful day. But as I picked up the printed pages, my eyes scanned the absurd, newly added line items. Imported white orchids from Holland, a custom champagne fountain, a second designer dress just for the reception. The new total was staring back at me, pushing well past $60,000. I looked up at her, keeping my voice calm, and simply stated that we needed to adhere to the original $45,000 budget we had agreed upon. I reminded her that $45,000 was already an incredible amount of money for a single evening. Brittany crossed her arms, her face twisting into a mask of pure disgust. She looked down at me not as a father who had raised her, but as a broken ATM that had just denied her transaction. She leaned forward, her voice dripping with venom, and told me that if I was going to be cheap and ruin her aesthetic, I should not even bother coming to the wedding. I sat there stunned, trying to process the cruelty in her tone. I had been in her life since she was 7 years old. I paid for her braces. I paid for her private college tuition in full, so she would graduate without a dime of debt. I bought her first car. I held her hand when she broke her arm in middle school. But to her, in that moment, none of that mattered. She pointed a perfectly manicured finger at me and said I would ruin the upscale aesthetic of her luxury country club wedding. She said Chad's wealthy investors would be there, and my presence would be an embarrassment. And then she delivered the final fatal blow. She said I had no right to tell her how to spend the money because I was not her real dad. I was just Robert. The air in the room grew heavy. The silence ringing in my ears was deafening. Chad stood behind her, smirking, practically hiding behind his fiancée's cruel entitlement. But the deepest cut, the one that truly shattered me, did not come from Brittany. I slowly turned my head to look at the other side of the living room, seeking the eyes of the woman I had built this entire life for. Diane, my wife of 20 years, was sitting on the velvet sofa. I looked at her, waiting for her to intervene, waiting for her to reprimand her daughter for speaking to me with such vicious disrespect. I waited for my partner to defend our shared life, to defend my dignity, to remind Brittany of the decades of unconditional love and financial support I had provided. But Diane did not say a word in my defense. She did not look angry. She did not even look surprised. Diane casually crossed her legs, took a slow, deliberate sip of her expensive Pinot Grigio, and finally met my gaze with eyes as cold as a frozen lake. She placed her wine glass on the coaster, smoothed her designer skirt, and told me that Brittany actually had a point. She said I was being unnecessarily stubborn about the budget. She looked me right in the eye, and said I should just let the kids have their special day without trying to make it all about me. In that exact fraction of a second, 20 years of marriage evaporated into thin air. I realized with absolute terrifying clarity that I was completely alone in my own home. I was not a husband. I was not a father. I was nothing more than a bank account, a utility, a host organism for 2 generations of financial parasites. Diane's silence, followed by her calculated agreement, was the ultimate betrayal. I remembered all the sacrifices I had made for Diane. I remembered pulling her out of a devastating financial bankruptcy 15 years ago, paying off her massive credit card debts without a single complaint, because I believed we were a team. I thought her spending habits had changed. I thought our love was built on mutual respect. But looking at her cold, indifferent face, I saw the undeniable truth. They had been discussing this behind my back. They had already decided that my usefulness had reached its expiration date. They just wanted my money, and they wanted me out of the picture. A younger man, a more foolish and emotional man, would have exploded. I would have shouted until my throat was raw. I would have demanded respect, listed all my sacrifices, and triggered a massive screaming argument that would have only painted me as the bitter, aggressive old man they already believed me to be. But my engineering background kicked in. When you realize you are standing inside a burning building, you do not stand there and argue with the fire. You calmly find the exits. You secure your assets. You survive. The internal shift within me was instantaneous and absolute. The old Robert, the forgiving, endlessly generous husband and stepfather, died right there in that leather armchair. The new Robert was born. I did not shed a single tear. I did not raise my voice a single decibel. I let the silence stretch out, forcing them to sit in their own uncomfortable cruelty. Then I slowly stood up. I smoothed the wrinkles from my trousers. I looked at Brittany, then at Chad, and finally at my wife. I forced a polite, empty smile onto my face. I nodded slowly, my voice steady and unnervingly calm. I simply said that I understood completely, and that it was her day and she should have it exactly the way she wanted. Diane looked slightly confused by my lack of resistance, a brief flicker of uncertainty crossing her features, but Brittany just rolled her eyes and turned back to her wedding binder, already dismissing me from her reality. I turned around and walked out of the living room. My posture was straight. My mind was racing with terrifying clarity. I walked down the long carpeted hallway toward my home office. It was my sanctuary, the only room in the house where I kept my private files, my architectural blueprints, and my computer. I closed the heavy oak door behind me and locked it. I sat down at my desk, the glow of the monitor illuminating my face in the dark room. I decided right then and there to teach them a very small, very immediate lesson in consequence. If I was not welcome at the wedding, my $45,000 would not be attending either. I opened my web browser and navigated to the bank's website. I planned to quietly transfer the entire wedding fund out of our joint account and into my private individual savings account. Let them figure out how to pay for the imported orchids themselves. I typed in my password, answered my security questions, and waited for the account dashboard to load. The screen refreshed. I stared at the numbers on the screen, my heart stopping in my chest. The joint account, which had held exactly $45,000 that morning, now had a balance of zero. Every single penny was gone. The drive to the bank the next morning was the quietest drive of my entire life. The sun was rising over the suburban hills, casting long shadows across the neatly manicured lawns of my neighborhood. For everyone else, it was just another ordinary Wednesday morning. People were walking their dogs, drinking their coffee, and commuting to work. But for me, the world had fundamentally shifted on its axis. The $45,000 missing from my account was not just money. It was 20 years of trust liquidated in a single afternoon. I did not feel panic. I did not feel the crushing weight of depression. Instead, my mind was operating with the cold, mechanical precision of a structural engineer analyzing a collapsed bridge. I needed to understand exactly where the structural failure occurred. I parked my truck in the lot of the downtown branch, turned off the engine, and took one deep, steadying breath. I walked through the heavy glass doors into the heavily air-conditioned lobby. The bank smelled of stale coffee and industrial carpet cleaner. It was a sterile, unforgiving environment which was perfectly fitting for the financial autopsy I was about to conduct. I bypassed the line of customers waiting for the tellers and walked directly to the mahogany desk of the branch manager, Mr. Collins. Collins had been my personal banker for nearly a decade. He knew my financial history. He knew the substantial wealth I kept carefully diversified in other institutions, and he always greeted me with a warm, eager handshake. But today, as I approached his desk, I saw the color completely drain from his face. He stood up awkwardly, his eyes darting away from mine and his hand visibly trembling as he motioned for me to sit down in the leather guest chair opposite his monitor. He already knew why I was there. I sat down, crossed my legs, and placed my hands neatly in my lap. I did not raise my voice. I looked at him with an expression of absolute calm and simply asked him to pull up the transaction history for my primary joint checking account. Collins swallowed hard. He adjusted his glasses, his fingers frantically clicking the mouse as he stared at his screen. He cleared his throat and told me that he had actually noticed the massive withdrawal late yesterday evening and was planning to call me this morning. I told him to skip the apologies and give me the exact procedural breakdown of how a $45,000 balance was reduced to zero without my phone ringing once. Collins turned his monitor slightly so I could see the glaring red numbers on the screen. He explained that my wife Diane had come into the branch in person at 3 o'clock yesterday afternoon. She did not use an automated machine. She did not make a wire transfer that could be frozen or reversed by a fraud department. She walked right up to a teller, presented her physical identification, and requested a certified cashier check for the entire balance of the account. Because her name was legally on the joint account, the teller was obligated to process the request immediately. She did not need my signature. She did not need my verbal authorization. According to the cold, hard laws of banking, every single penny in that account belonged to her just as much as it belonged to me. Collins looked at me with genuine pity and explained that Diane had taken the cashier check and walked straight out the front doors. The money was completely untraceable. It was gone instantly, converted into a guaranteed paper instrument that she could deposit into a secret account at any other institution in the country. I sat there in the uncomfortable leather chair, absorbing the terrifying reality of the procedure. Diane had not acted in a moment of emotional anger. This was not a rash decision made during a fight. She had carefully timed her visit to the bank. She had brought her identification, waited in line, and calmly requested a certified check while I was at home pulling weeds in the garden. She had smiled at the teller, taken the envelope containing my money, and then driven home to sit on the velvet sofa, sip her white wine, and watch her daughter tell me I was entirely worthless. The level of sociopathic calculation was staggering. It was a flawless financial execution. I looked back at Collins. I told him I understood the legality of the joint account, and I asked him to print a physical copy of the withdrawal slip and the receipt for the cashier check. I needed the paper trail for my lawyer. Collins nodded quickly, eager to be helpful, and sent the documents to the printer behind his desk. He handed me the warm sheets of paper. I folded them perfectly in half and slid them into the inside pocket of my jacket. I thanked him for his time and began to stand up. I was ready to leave, ready to call my attorney and begin the process of liquidating my other assets before Diane could find them. But as I pushed my chair back, Collins cleared his throat again. He looked even more nervous than when I had first walked in. A bead of sweat was forming on his forehead. He leaned forward across his desk, lowering his voice to a hushed whisper. He asked me if I also wanted him to print a copy of the secondary paperwork Diane had submitted to the loan officer yesterday afternoon. I froze. My hand stopped halfway to the door handle. I turned back to face him, my expression never changing, but my heart pounding a heavy rhythm against my ribs. I asked him exactly what secondary paperwork he was referring to. Collins wiped his forehead with the back of his hand and told me that before Diane left the bank with the cashier check, she had sat down with their mortgage department. She had submitted a comprehensive application to open a massive home equity line of credit against our primary residence. The words hung in the sterile air of the bank. Home equity line of credit. I stared at Collins. The leather chair suddenly felt like a trap. That house was not just a piece of property to me. It was a custom-built marvel of structural engineering that I had designed myself 25 years ago. I bought the land long before Diane ever entered my life. I had paid the contractors entirely in cash. The deed to that $1.2 million property was locked in a fireproof safe solely in my name. The idea that someone could walk into a bank and apply for a loan against the foundation of my life work without my knowledge was a mathematical impossibility. I asked Collins to explain exactly how my wife could initiate a massive loan on a property she did not legally own. Collins nervously wiped his hands on his trousers and clicked his mouse again. He explained that as my legal spouse, Diane, had brought in a thick folder of documents claiming we were doing massive renovations to prepare the house for the wedding. She had presented a preliminary application for a $300,000 line of credit. Collins reached into a drawer and pulled out a photocopy of the application. He slid it across the mahogany desk. I looked down at the bottom right corner of the paper. There, in blue ink, was my signature. It was not a sloppy fake. It was a terrifyingly accurate reproduction of my exact handwriting. Diane had clearly spent weeks practicing the curve of my letters. She had intentionally forged my consent to mortgage the very roof over my head. Staring at that forged signature, a cold and bitter memory washed over me. I realized she was not just being greedy in the present moment. She was repeating a very dark history. 15 years ago, only 5 years into our marriage, I discovered that Diane was drowning in a sea of hidden financial ruin. She had secretly accumulated over $400,000 in credit card debt and failed retail business loans. She was weeks away from federal bankruptcy, facing the absolute destruction of her life and her young daughter's future. I loved her back then. I believed in giving people a second chance. So I stepped in. I paid off every single penny of her debt in one single afternoon. I saved her from total humiliation and public ruin. But I did not tell her how easily I paid it. I never told Diane that I had sold my commercial structural engineering firm for a massive fortune right before we met. I spent my early career building suspension bridges and commercial skyscrapers. When I sold the company, I secured a wealth that most people could not even comprehend. I never told her about the diversified investment portfolios or the offshore trusts I had quietly maintained. When I bailed her out 15 years ago, I looked her in the eyes and lied. I told her that paying her debts had completely wiped out my life savings. I told her we would have to live strictly on my modest pension for the rest of our lives. I did it to protect her from her own worst impulses. I wanted to see if she could live a simple and honest life without the temptation of endless wealth. For 15 years, I played the role of a middle-class retiree counting his pennies. And for 15 years, she played the role of a supportive wife while secretly resenting every single budget conversation we ever had. Now the absolute truth of her nature was laid bare on the bank manager desk. She had not changed at all. The moment she realized she needed more money to fund her daughter's extravagant lifestyle, she simply reverted to her old parasitic habits. But this time, instead of racking up credit card debt, she was trying to steal the equity of the only asset she knew I had left. She believed that house was my entire net worth. She thought if she drained the joint account and mortgaged the property, I would be left completely destitute and entirely dependent on her mercy. She thought she was outsmarting a helpless old man who had given her his last dime. She had no idea she was trying to rob a man who could buy this entire bank branch in cash. The audacity of her plan was almost impressive. She had mapped out every detail, assuming my routine was as predictable as the sunrise. She counted on my blind trust. She relied on the fact that I never checked the mail before she did, and that I never asked questions about her afternoon errands. She saw my quiet nature as a fatal weakness. She confused my patience with stupidity. Sitting in that bank, I realized I was no longer dealing with a wife and a stepdaughter. I was dealing with hostile invaders who had breached the perimeter of my life. My engineering mind compartmentalized the pain of the betrayal, locking it away in a dark room. Emotion is a useless metric when a structure is collapsing. You must rely purely on mathematics and leverage. I picked up the forged application. My hands did not shake. My breathing remained perfectly even. I asked Collins what the current status of the loan was. He swallowed hard and told me that because of the massive requested amount, the loan officer required an in-person appraisal of the property and my physical presence to finalize the disbursement. Diane had scheduled the appraisal for Friday afternoon, right when she knew I was supposed to be out at my weekly woodworking class. She had orchestrated the entire timeline perfectly. She was going to finalize the theft of my home just 48 hours before her daughter walked down the aisle. She intended to hand Brittany the wedding of her dreams, using money stolen directly from my forged signature. I folded the forged application with the exact same precision I used to fold my engineering blueprints. I placed it in my jacket pocket, right next to the receipt for the stolen $45,000. I looked at Collins and told him to immediately flag the loan application as fraudulent and freeze all further processing. I told him if a single bank employee authorized that loan, I would hold the institution personally liable for catastrophic financial damages. Collins nodded frantically, typing the freeze order into his terminal before I even finished my sentence. I stood up from the leather chair. I had all the diagnostic data I needed. The structural failure of my marriage was complete and total. It was time to leave the bank and build a legal fortress that would completely crush them when it collapsed. I pulled my truck into the driveway of my home, the tires crunching softly against the gravel. The house was completely silent. Diane luxury vehicle and Brittany convertible were both gone from the garage. I knew exactly where they were. Before I left for the bank this morning, Diane had brightly announced that they had a 3-hour appointment at a high-end bakery across town for a premium wedding cake tasting. She had smiled when she said it, asking me to make sure I watered her hydrangeas while they were out. The memory of that innocent smile now made my stomach turn. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The air conditioning hummed quietly. The house looked exactly as I had left it, an absolute picture of domestic tranquility. But I was no longer looking at a safe haven. I was standing inside an active crime scene. I did not take off my shoes. I did not go to the kitchen for a glass of water. I walked straight down the hallway past my own office and went directly into Diane's private study. For 20 years, I had respected her privacy. I never opened her mail. I never checked her phone. And I never questioned the heavy brass lock she had installed on the bottom drawer of her antique mahogany desk. She always claimed it was where she kept old family diaries and sentimental letters from her late grandmother. I had believed her because I chose to trust my wife. That trust was now a massive liability. I stared at the brass lock. It was a solid, expensive piece of hardware. It was the only thing standing between me and the absolute truth. I walked out to the garage and opened my heavy-duty tool chest. I bypassed the standard screwdrivers and grabbed my commercial-grade cordless drill. I selected a titanium-coated drill bit designed specifically for piercing solid metal. I walked back into her study, the weight of the tool feeling familiar and grounding in my hands. I placed the tip of the drill bit directly into the center of the brass keyhole. I checked my watch. They had been gone for barely an hour, meaning I had plenty of time. But the adrenaline pumping through my veins made every second feel like an eternity. I squeezed the trigger. The drill roared to life in the quiet room. The high-pitched screech of metal tearing into metal echoed off the walls. Small shards of brass flew into the air, landing softly on the expensive Persian rug. The smell of heated metal filled the room. I leaned my weight into the drill, pushing harder, refusing to stop until the internal pins of the lock finally snapped. With a sharp crack, the lock cylinder gave way and spun freely. I pulled the drill back, set it on the floor, and grabbed the brass handle. I pulled the heavy bottom drawer open. It slid out smoothly on its tracks. There were no sentimental diaries. There were no letters from a grandmother. The drawer was filled with perfectly organized manila folders with neat typed labels. It was the filing system of a professional con artist. I reached in and pulled out the thickest folder sitting right in the front. The label simply read, "Home Renovations." I flipped it open and found exactly what the bank manager had described. There were copies of the $300,000 home equity line of credit application, complete with my flawlessly forged signature on every single page. There were also glossy brochures for luxury vacation packages to Europe, and printed emails from a high-end luxury car dealership proving that the money was never meant for the house. It was meant to fund a lavish new life for her and her daughter. But as damning as those papers were, they were exactly what I expected to find. It was the thinner red folder sitting quietly underneath the loan documents that made the blood freeze in my veins. The red folder had no label. I picked it up. It felt strangely heavy. I untied the string closure and opened the flap. Inside was a stack of official medical documents printed on the letterhead of a private, highly expensive psychiatric clinic located 2 towns over. I did not recognize the clinic or the name of the doctor at the top of the page. I started reading the primary evaluation report. My eyes scanned the terrifying clinical language: severe cognitive decline, aggressive behavioral outbursts, advanced stages of early-onset dementia, unfit to manage personal finances, unfit to live independently. My breathing stopped. I read the pages again to make sure I was not hallucinating. This doctor, whom I had never met in my entire life, had written a comprehensive, legally binding evaluation, declaring me completely mentally incompetent. I flipped to the back of the folder and found the final piece of the puzzle. It was a drafted legal petition prepared by a shady local attorney. The petition used the fake medical evaluation as grounds to immediately strip me of all my legal rights and grant Diane full emergency power of attorney. But the horror did not stop there. Attached to the petition was a signed contract for a state-funded low-income assisted living facility located over 100 miles away. The facility was notorious for its terrible conditions. Diane and Chad were not just planning to steal my money and mortgage my house. They had orchestrated a clinical assassination. They were going to have me declared legally insane, lock me away in a miserable institution where no one would believe a word I said, and take absolute control of everything I had ever built. The stakes were no longer just financial. They were coming for my freedom, my sanity, and the remaining years of my life. I carefully placed the documents back into the red folder, my hands completely steady. They wanted a war. They had absolutely no idea the level of destruction I was about to bring to their front door. I sat down in the heavy leather chair behind Diane's desk, the red folder open in my lap. I needed to read every single word to understand the exact dimensions of the trap they had built around me. The first document was a comprehensive psychiatric evaluation dated just 2 weeks ago. I looked at the name of the doctor at the top of the page, a specialist located in a city 3 hours away. I had never spoken to this man in my life, yet his signature was at the bottom of a 6-page report detailing my supposed mental collapse. According to the document, Diane had brought me in for a private consultation because she was terrified for my physical safety. She had sat in a room with this doctor and spun a web of absolute lies. She claimed I was leaving the stove on, wandering the neighborhood in the middle of the night and becoming violently aggressive when confronted. She described incidents that never happened, mapping out a fictional timeline of my declining sanity over the past 8 months. I read through the specific examples she had provided. She told the doctor I had forgotten my own anniversary, a date I had never missed in 20 years. She claimed I was hoarding garbage in the garage when in reality I was carefully organizing my expensive woodworking supplies. The doctor had taken her words as absolute truth, noting that my absence from the follow-up appointments was clear evidence of my paranoid delusions and refusal to accept necessary treatment. The official diagnosis, printed in bold letters at the bottom of page 4, was severe early-onset dementia, accompanied by dangerous behavioral instability. The recommendation was immediate and permanent placement in a secure full-time care facility to prevent me from harming myself or my family. My blood ran completely cold as I turned to the next document. It was a drafted legal petition for emergency guardianship. This was not just about stealing $300,000 from a home equity loan. This was a complete and total eradication of my existence as a free man. Losing money was an inconvenience. Losing the house would have been a tragedy. But losing the fundamental right to walk out my own front door, to breathe fresh air on my own terms, to simply exist as a sovereign individual, that was a fate worse than death. If a judge signed that emergency guardianship petition based on this fraudulent medical evaluation, Diane would be granted absolute legal control over every aspect of my life. I would instantly lose the right to manage my own bank accounts, the right to make my own medical decisions, and the right to choose where I lived. I would not even be allowed to hire a lawyer to defend myself, because legally I would not be considered competent enough to sign a contract. They had found the one legal loophole that would completely disarm me. They were going to strip me of my human rights, load me into the back of a car, and lock me inside the state-funded facility they had already selected. I looked at the brochure for the facility attached to the back of the petition. It was a bleak, underfunded institution, notorious for heavily medicating its residents just to keep them quiet. That was where they planned to leave me to rot, while they lived in my custom-built home, spending my money and throwing lavish parties for their wealthy friends. I checked the date on the legal petition. Diane had an appointment with a family court judge scheduled for Monday morning, exactly 2 days after Brittany's luxury wedding. They were going to celebrate the wedding all weekend, cut the cake, drink the champagne, and then wake up on Monday to quietly execute the final phase of my destruction. They thought they had backed me into a corner where escape was mathematically impossible. I slowly closed the red folder and tied the string back into place. I placed it exactly where I had found it, nestled beneath the forged loan documents. I closed the heavy bottom drawer and pushed it shut. I could not fix the broken lock, but I did not care. By the time Diane realized someone had breached her secret files, it would be far too late. I stood up and walked out of the study. The anger I felt was no longer hot or chaotic. It was completely frozen, sharpened into a lethal weapon. They had chosen to escalate this from simple financial theft to a fight for my actual life. I walked into my own office and picked up my phone. I dialed the direct cell phone number of the only man I could trust, my longtime estate lawyer, Vincent Gallagher. I listened to the phone ring, knowing that the moment he answered, the silent adjustment would be over, and the absolute destruction of my wife and stepdaughter would officially begin. The mahogany door to Vincent Gallagher private office clicked shut, sealing us inside a soundproof vault of legal privilege. Vincent was 60 years old and one of the most ruthless estate attorneys in the state. He had managed my hidden assets for over a decade. He was a man who appreciated order and despised incompetence. I sat down in the leather chair across from his massive desk and placed the red folder and the forged bank documents right in the center of his blotter. I did not offer a greeting. I simply told him to read every single page. Vincent put on his reading glasses and opened the file. The office was dead silent for 10 solid minutes. I watched his eyes scan the forged signature on the $300,000 home loan application. I watched his jaw tighten as he moved on to the psychiatric evaluation and the emergency guardianship petition. When he finally reached the brochure for the state-funded facility, Where my wife intended to lock me away, his face turned a deep shade of crimson. He took off his glasses and threw them onto the desk. He reached for his desk phone and aggressively punched a button. He told his secretary to cancel all his appointments for the rest of the day and to get the district attorney on the line immediately. I reached across the desk and firmly pressed my hand down on the telephone receiver, disconnecting the call. Vincent looked at me as if I were the one who had lost my mind. He leaned forward and practically shouted that Diane had just committed multiple counts of felony fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy to commit medical malpractice. He told me she was planning to illegally strip me of my constitutional rights and that we needed to have her arrested before she even finished her cake tasting. I looked him dead in the eye and told him to sit down. My voice was quiet, steady, and completely stripped of emotion. I told him that calling the police right now was the absolute worst thing we could do. If we called the police, she would be arrested. She would cry in front of a judge. She would claim she was just a concerned wife trying to help a sick husband, and she would likely post bail by dinner time. The criminal justice system is slow and full of loopholes for wealthy-looking women who cry on command. I told Vincent I did not want her merely arrested. I wanted her absolutely dismantled. I wanted her to confidently walk into her own trap and find that the floor had completely disappeared beneath her. Vincent slowly sat back down in his chair. He studied my face, recognizing the cold, structural approach I always took to complex problems. He folded his hands on the desk and asked me exactly what my blueprint was. I laid out the strategy with mathematical precision. First, we needed to address my liquid assets. Over the past 15 years, Vincent had helped me structure my wealth into various private accounts and shell corporations that Diane knew absolutely nothing about. I told him to initiate an immediate transfer of every single liquid asset I possessed into an offshore irrevocable trust. I wanted my personal net worth on paper to reflect exactly $0. If a judge ever did grant her power of attorney over my finances, I wanted her to inherit a completely empty kingdom. Vincent nodded, typing furiously on his secure laptop. He confirmed that the transfers could be executed within the hour, completely insulating my actual wealth from any domestic court order she might try to leverage. Next, we moved to the most critical asset on the board: the house. The house was the anchor of her entire scheme. She wanted the $300,000 loan to fund her luxury lifestyle, and she wanted the physical property to house her entitled daughter and her useless fiancé. The house was fully paid off, and the deed was solely in my name, but as my wife, she had a legal claim to reside there as long as we were married. I told Vincent we were going to sever that claim immediately. I instructed him to draft a quitclaim deed. I was going to legally sell the entire $1.2 million property to a blind corporate trust managed by a ruthless property management group that Vincent frequently used for hostile real estate acquisitions. We would execute the sale for a nominal fee, legally transferring the title of the home entirely out of my name. Vincent looked up from his screen, a sharp, predatory smile forming on his lips. He understood exactly what I was doing. If I did not own the house, Diane could not mortgage it. If I did not own the house, the bank would permanently cancel the forged loan application when their title search came back empty. And most importantly, if I did not own the house, Diane and Brittany would instantly become unauthorized squatters in a property owned by a faceless corporation. Vincent asked about the timeline. I told him the wedding was on Saturday. Diane had scheduled the bank appraisal for Friday afternoon, and she had her secret court hearing for the guardianship petition on Monday morning. I told Vincent the property transfer needed to be finalized and recorded with the county clerk by tomorrow morning. I also instructed him to negotiate a temporary 3-day lease-back agreement with the new corporate owners, allowing me to remain on the property just long enough to pack my safe and my essential belongings while they were distracted with wedding preparations. Vincent agreed the timeline was tight, but entirely feasible. He picked up his pen and began drafting the legal framework on a yellow legal pad. But he pointed out one final crucial detail. Even if we emptied my accounts and sold the house, Diane was still legally my wife. If anything happened to me, she would still be my next of kin. She would still have the legal authority to make medical decisions on my behalf if I were incapacitated. I told him that was the final piece of the architecture. I told him to draw up the divorce papers immediately. I wanted them citing irreconcilable differences, extreme financial abuse, and fraudulent medical conspiracy. I wanted the divorce petition filed and heavily sealed by a judge before the end of the week. Vincent looked at the pile of documents on his desk. He had spent his entire career watching wealthy men lose their fortunes to greedy spouses because they let emotion cloud their judgment. He looked at me with a profound sense of respect. He told me that by the time Diane woke up on her daughter's wedding day, she would have no money, no husband, no house, and absolutely no legal power to do anything about it. I stood up from the leather chair. I told him to get to work. I had to go home and pretend to be an ignorant, broken old man for just a few more days. I had to go make my wife a cup of tea. Vincent leaned back in his heavy leather chair, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. He watched me process the divorce strategy, but I could tell his mind was still actively dissecting the battlefield. He was a man who hated leaving any loose ends, and something about Diane's timeline was bothering him. He picked up his gold pen and began tapping it rhythmically against the edge of his desk. He looked at me and asked about the immediate logistics of the wedding itself. He wanted to know exactly how a $60,000 luxury country club event was being funded by a woman who until yesterday afternoon had absolutely no money of her own. I explained the setup. I told him that I had always intended to pay for the wedding. Several months ago, I had personally signed the vendor contracts. I used my premium credit card to place the initial deposits for the venue, the high-end florist, and the professional photography team. I had authorized the final balances to be automatically charged to that same card on the morning of the wedding. It was a standard arrangement built entirely on the assumption that I would be attending as the proud father of the bride. Vincent stopped tapping his pen. A slow, deeply calculated smile spread across his face. He leaned forward and asked if I was the primary guarantor on those contracts. I nodded. I was the sole signer. Diane and Brittany had merely been listed as the event contacts for logistical planning. Vincent let out a short, sharp laugh. He shook his head and said that Diane had made a catastrophic tactical error. In her rush to steal the $45,000 from the joint account and fraudulently mortgage the house, she had completely forgotten about the structural mechanics of the wedding itself. She assumed that because the deposits were paid and the date was locked, the event was guaranteed. She assumed my credit card would simply process the final payments while I sat at home quietly accepting my exile. Vincent pulled out a fresh sheet of paper. He explained the flaw in her plan with the precision of a surgeon. Because I was the sole guarantor on those contracts, I was the only person with the legal authority to alter them. My credit card was the financial anchor keeping the entire event from floating away. He told me that luxury country clubs and high-end vendors do not operate on goodwill. They operate on strict legally binding liability clauses. If the primary guarantor physically cancels the authorization for the final payment, the vendors will not simply ask the bride for a check on the day of the event. They will immediately void the contract and shut down operations. He asked me if I remembered signing a zero liability cancellation clause. I thought back to the mountain of paperwork the country club manager had handed me. I remembered reading a specific paragraph stating that the guarantor could unilaterally cancel the event up to 48 hours before the start time, forfeiting the initial deposit, but completely eliminating liability for the final balance. I confirmed to Vincent that the clause existed. Vincent locked his eyes onto mine. He told me that Diane thought she was stealing a $45,000 wedding from me. She thought she was taking the money and the party leaving me with absolutely nothing. He told me it was time to teach her a lesson in financial gravity. If she wanted to host a luxury wedding without my presence, she would have to do it without my credit card. The strategy was brutally simple, but the execution had to be flawless. I could not simply call the credit card company and cancel the card. If the card declined on the morning of the wedding, Diane might be able to use the stolen $45,000 and pay the vendors in cash to save face. I did not want her to have the opportunity to save face. I wanted the entire structure to collapse around her while she was standing inside it. I told Vincent I was going to drive to the country club in person tomorrow morning. I was going to sit down with the event manager and physically invoke the zero liability cancellation clause. I was going to formally void the venue contract, pulling the rug out from under the entire reception. I would then personally contact the florist and the photographer, informing them that the event guarantor had withdrawn financial authorization. By the time I was finished, there would be no ballroom, no imported orchids, and no one to take pictures of her perfect aesthetic. Vincent nodded in absolute approval. He noted that because I was doing this legally and in accordance with the contract terms, Diane would have absolutely no recourse. She could not sue the country club, and she could not force them to host the event. She would be left holding a useless schedule for a party that legally no longer existed. He reminded me that timing was everything. I had to execute the cancellations exactly 48 hours before the event. That would ensure the country club had enough time to lock their doors and assign their staff elsewhere, but it would give Diane absolutely no time to find a replacement venue for 200 guests. I stood up from the desk. The blueprint was complete. I had walked into Vincent's office as a victim of a massive financial and medical conspiracy. I was walking out as the architect of their absolute destruction. I shook Vincent's hand. He told me to stay cold, stay quiet, and let the trap snap shut. I left the office and walked out into the bright afternoon sun. I had to go back to the house. I had to go back and smile at the woman who was actively trying to lock me in a psychiatric ward. The silent adjustment was in full effect. Walking back through the front door of my house felt entirely different this time. I was no longer a man returning to his sanctuary. I was an undercover operative infiltrating a hostile environment. The afternoon sun was streaming through the large bay windows, casting a warm golden light over the expensive hardwood floors that I had installed with my own 2 hands. The house was quiet, but I could hear the faint sound of the television coming from the master bedroom. Diane was home. I stood in the foyer for a moment, taking a deep breath to completely bury the cold, calculating architect I had been in Vincent Gallagher's office. I needed to lower my shoulders. I needed to soften my gaze. I had to put the mask of the defeated, helpless old man back onto my face. It was the most important performance of my entire life. I walked into the kitchen and went straight to the espresso machine. For 2 decades, I had made Diane a vanilla latte every single afternoon. It was a ritual of my affection, a small act of service that I had always performed with genuine love. Today, it was a tactical maneuver. I frothed the milk, watching the white foam rise in the steel pitcher. I poured the rich espresso into her favorite porcelain mug and carefully added the vanilla syrup. I placed the mug on a small silver tray, along with a linen napkin. I looked down at the coffee. A younger man might have been tempted to spit in it or throw it against the wall. But I felt absolutely nothing. You do not get angry at a ghost, and as far as I was concerned, the woman sitting in the next room was already completely erased from my future. I carried the silver tray down the hallway and gently pushed open the door to the master bedroom. Diane was reclining on the custom-upholstered chaise lounge, wearing a silk robe and casually flipping through a high-fashion magazine. She looked up as I entered. For a fraction of a second, I saw a flicker of apprehension in her eyes. She was waiting to see if I was going to bring up the wedding budget again. She was waiting to see if I was going to fight. I kept my eyes lowered, my posture slightly stooped, and offered her a weak, apologetic smile. I walked over and placed the silver tray on the glass table next to her. I told her I thought she might want her afternoon coffee. Diane stared at me, her posture instantly relaxing, as a wave of absolute smugness washed over her face. She thought she had won. She thought my silence yesterday, and my subservience today meant that I had completely surrendered to her authority. She picked up the porcelain mug, took a slow sip, and let out a contented sigh. She looked at me with a sickeningly sweet expression, the kind of look one might give a well-behaved dog. She told me she was glad to see I was finally acting reasonable. She said she knew the conversation yesterday was difficult, but that I needed to understand my place in the family dynamic. She actually used the phrase "my place." I stood there nodding slowly, my hands clasped together in front of me. I told her I just wanted everyone to be happy. I told her I did not want to cause any more stress so close to the wedding. The irony of my words tasted sweeter than the coffee she was drinking, knowing that in less than 48 hours, her entire world was going to collapse into absolute ruin. Just as Diane was about to offer another condescending remark, the heavy oak front door opened and slammed shut. The loud, obnoxious voice of my future stepson-in-law echoed down the hallway. Chad was yelling something to Brittany about paint swatches and natural lighting. Diane smiled brightly, setting her coffee down, and told me the kids were here to look at the house. I followed her out of the bedroom and into the hallway. Chad was standing in the foyer, wearing designer loafers without socks and an expensive linen shirt that I knew he had purchased using Diane's stolen credit cards. Brittany was right beside him, holding a massive binder of interior design samples. They barely acknowledged my presence as I stood quietly in the background. Chad clapped his hands together, rubbing them in a gesture of greedy anticipation. He looked at Diane and loudly announced that they needed to finalize the measurements for the new nursery. My blood pressure remained perfectly steady as I watched him walk straight past me and open the door to my private home office. This was the exact room where I had discovered the emptied bank account just 24 hours ago. This was my sanctuary, the room filled with my engineering awards, my custom-drafted blueprints, and my expensive mahogany desk. Chad strolled into my office as if he already owned it. He pulled a yellow metal measuring tape from his pocket and let it snap with a loud metallic clack. I stood in the doorway, watching him. Diane and Brittany stood right behind me, excitedly whispering about whether they should rip out my custom-built bookshelves to make room for a luxury crib. Chad walked over to the large bay window, completely ignoring my presence. He pressed the metal tape against the wall, stretching it across the beautiful oak panels I had meticulously stained and varnished. He loudly complained that the dark wood was incredibly depressing and that they would need to hire a crew to tear it all down and paint the room a modern, sterile white. He turned to me, a mocking smirk plastered across his face. He asked me how long it would take me to clear all my useless junk out of the room. He said they needed to bring the contractors in by next Tuesday, and he did not want my old dusty papers getting in the way of their renovations. The psychological tension in the room was suffocating. Chad was standing in a house that I had completely sold to a ruthless corporate entity just 3 hours ago. He was measuring walls that he would legally be evicted from on Monday morning. He was arrogantly demanding I remove my belongings, completely unaware that I was already packing my safe and preparing to leave them to face the wrath of a heavily armed property management eviction team. The arrogance radiating from him was so thick it was almost physical. He thought he was intimidating a weak, helpless retiree. He had absolutely no idea he was mocking the man who held the detonator to his entire existence. Brittany chimed in, telling Chad not to worry about my timeline. She looked at me with cold, dismissive eyes and said that her mother would make sure I was moved out of the way before the contractors arrived. She was referring to the fraudulent psychiatric facility. She was openly talking about my forced institutionalization right to my face, cloaking it in the language of home renovation. They were so confident in their terrible scheme that they were practically bragging about it. I did not flinch. I did not glare at them. I looked at Chad, who was still holding the metal measuring tape against my wall, waiting for me to react. I forced a look of mild confusion and submissive agreement onto my face. I nodded slowly, looking around the room as if I were seeing it for the last time. I told Chad that he did not need to worry about my things. I told him in a quiet, reassuring voice that by the time Monday morning rolled around, this room would be completely empty, and he would have all the space he truly deserved. Chad laughed, a harsh, grating sound that echoed off the mahogany walls. He let the measuring tape snap back into its casing and told me it was good to see I was finally being useful. He patted me hard on the shoulder as he walked past me, leaving the room to go inspect the kitchen. Brittany and Diane followed him, their voices fading down the hallway as they debated whether to replace my imported granite countertops. I remained standing in the doorway of my office. I looked at the spot on the wall where Chad had placed his tape measure. I smiled. It was not a polite smile. It was the smile of a predator watching its prey happily wander into a steel cage and lock the door from the inside. I turned off the light in my office and walked away, perfectly content to let them enjoy the illusion of their victory for 2 more days. Thursday morning arrived with a crisp breeze. I told Diane I was going out to buy some special fertilizer for her garden. She did not even look up from her morning television show, just waved her hand dismissively. I walked out to my truck, climbed inside, and drove straight toward the absolute pinnacle of local high society. The drive took exactly 30 minutes. I pulled up to the massive wrought iron gates of the Oakwood Valley Country Club. The grounds were flawlessly manicured, the grass a vibrant green, and the main clubhouse stood like a monument to excessive wealth. This was the exact location where Brittany planned to parade her stolen status in front of 200 guests. I parked my truck between 2 luxury sedans, turned off the engine, and gathered my meticulously organized leather portfolio. I walked through the grand double doors of the clubhouse and approached the front reception desk. The air inside smelled of fresh lilies and expensive floor wax. I asked to speak directly with the senior event director, a man named Mr. Montgomery. The receptionist noticed my plain clothes and hesitated for a fraction of a second before calling his office. A few moments later, Montgomery appeared. He was a tall man in a tailored suit wearing a polite but highly practiced smile. He recognized my name from the master ledger and immediately assumed I was there to drop off the final seating charts, or perhaps upgrade the champagne package. He extended his hand warmly, welcoming the primary financial guarantor of his most lucrative event of the weekend. I shook his hand firmly and asked if we could speak privately in his office. Montgomery led me down a carpeted hallway into a spacious room overlooking the 18th hole of the golf course. He offered me a seat in a velvet chair and asked what he could do to make my stepdaughter special day even more perfect. I opened my leather portfolio and pulled out the original 80-page vendor contract I had signed 6 months ago. I placed it squarely on the center of his glass desk. I did not smile. I looked him perfectly in the eyes and told him I was not there to upgrade the champagne. I told him I was there to execute a complete and immediate cancellation of the entire event. Montgomery's practiced smile completely vanished. The color drained from his face. He leaned forward, visibly confused, and told me that the wedding was only 48 hours away. He reminded me that the custom catering had already been ordered, and the ballroom was scheduled to be draped in imported silk starting tomorrow morning. He warned me that canceling now would mean forfeiting my initial $15,000 deposit. I nodded slowly. I told him I was fully aware of the forfeited deposit. I considered it a very reasonable price to pay for my permanent freedom. I reached across the desk and opened the contract to page 42. I tapped my finger directly on the zero liability cancellation clause. I reminded him that as the sole financial guarantor, I had the absolute legal right to void the agreement with exactly 48 hours' notice, completely absolving me of the remaining $45,000 balance. Montgomery stared at the legal clause, his eyes darting back and forth across the page. He knew I was right. He picked up his desk phone to call his legal department, but I stopped him. I told him my lawyer had already reviewed the document and sent a certified electronic copy of the cancellation notice to the club corporate office 10 minutes ago. I pushed a silver pen across the desk. I told him I needed his physical signature on my copy of the termination agreement to confirm that my credit card was entirely removed from their system and that all services were permanently halted. Montgomery realized he was completely cornered by his own corporate policy. He picked up the pen and signed the paper. With that single stroke of ink, a luxury venue ceased to exist. The ballroom doors would remain locked on Saturday. The catering staff would be sent home. The grand reception was legally dead. I folded the signed cancellation document and placed it back into my portfolio. I thanked Montgomery for his time and walked out of his office. I did not leave the country club immediately. I walked out to the expansive stone patio overlooking the golf course and sat down on a teakwood bench. The sun was warm against my face. I pulled my cell phone from my pocket. Destroying the venue was the heaviest blow, but I am a man who appreciates absolute structural integrity. I could not leave any supporting pillars standing. I found the number for the high-end floral boutique that was supposed to deliver $10,000 worth of white orchids. I dialed the number and waited for the owner to answer. When she picked up, I calmly identified myself as the primary account holder. I informed her that the wedding was entirely canceled and that my credit card authorization for the final payment was officially revoked. She gasped loudly, panicking about the massive inventory she had already prepared. I told her I was sorry for the inconvenience, but any further financial disputes would need to be taken up directly with Diane, who had absolutely no money to pay her. I ended the call. Next, I dialed the number for the professional photography and videography team. They were charging $8,000 to capture every moment of Britney aesthetic triumph. The lead photographer answered the phone cheerfully, asking if I was calling to confirm the drone flight paths over the country club. I kept my voice perfectly flat and told him the event was off. I told him the venue was locked and the financial guarantor had withdrawn all funding. I instructed him to immediately cancel the deployment of his crew and permanently delete my credit card from his billing system. He tried to argue, stating that he had turned down other lucrative jobs for this weekend. I simply told him he was free to take the weekend off and hung up the phone. I sat on the bench for a few more minutes, listening to the distant sound of golf clubs striking golf balls. The air was incredibly peaceful. I had methodically severed every single financial artery keeping the wedding alive. I had left them with absolutely nothing. Diane and Brittany were currently sitting in my house picking out paint colors for my office, entirely oblivious to the fact that their grand society wedding was now nothing more than a collection of voided contracts and angry vendors. The trap was completely set. All I had to do now was go home, pack my bags, and wait for them to walk straight into the abyss. The sun was beginning to set on Thursday evening, casting long, dark shadows across the hardwood floors of my home. I was sitting in my private office, quietly organizing the contents of my fireproof safe. I had already packed my most valuable architectural blueprints and my mother antique pocket watch. The house was calm, but it was the heavy artificial calm that always precedes a massive storm. Suddenly, the rich smell of roasted chicken and rosemary drifted down the hallway. I stopped what I was doing and looked at the closed door of my office. Diane was cooking dinner. This was a profoundly unusual event. My wife had not cooked a meal from scratch in over 5 years, preferring to order expensive takeout or dine at high-end restaurants using my credit cards. The sudden domestic effort was a blazing red warning light in my mind. She was setting the stage for something highly calculated. I closed the heavy steel door of my safe and spun the combination dial just as a soft knock echoed against my office door. Diane slowly opened it and stepped inside. She was not wearing her usual designer silk loungewear. Instead, she was wearing a soft beige cashmere sweater and comfortable slacks looking exactly like the warm, supportive wife she had pretended to be 2 decades ago. She was holding a silver tray with a steaming plate of roasted chicken, fresh vegetables, and a tall glass of my favorite red wine. She offered me a gentle, tired smile that looked so incredibly genuine it actually made my stomach turn. She walked over to my mahogany desk and carefully set the tray down in front of me. She let out a long, dramatic sigh and sat down in the leather guest chair opposite my desk. She looked down at her hands for a moment, playing the role of an exhausted peacemaker to absolute perfection. Then she looked up into my eyes and delivered a flawless, fake apology. She told me she was incredibly sorry for how things had escalated over the past few days. She lowered her voice, sounding deeply regretful, as she said she knew Brittany had been incredibly cruel about the wedding budget. She told me that the stress of planning such a massive luxury event was destroying her daughter's nerves and making everyone act completely out of character. She leaned forward, reaching across the desk to gently place her soft hand over mine. The physical contact required every ounce of my willpower to endure. I wanted to pull my hand away. I wanted to tell her that I knew about the forged bank loans, the stolen $45,000, and the horrifying psychiatric evaluation currently sitting in her locked drawer. But my engineering discipline kept my body perfectly still. I looked at her hand resting on mine, and I forced my facial muscles to relax into an expression of quiet, grateful acceptance. I nodded slowly, telling her that I understood how stressful weddings could be, and that I just wanted peace in our household. Diane smiled brightly, her eyes shining with absolute triumph. She squeezed my hand affectionately and told me I was a wonderful husband. She stood up, walked around my desk, and began massaging my shoulders. Her fingers pressed into my muscles, mimicking genuine care while her mind was actively plotting to lock me inside a state-funded mental institution. I sat there letting her perform her twisted charade, waiting patiently for the true motive to reveal itself. I knew she had not roasted a chicken and massaged my shoulders simply to apologize. She needed something from me. After a few minutes of rubbing my shoulders, she casually walked back around to the front of the desk. She reached into the pocket of her cashmere sweater and pulled out a neatly folded stack of papers. She let out a small, dismissive laugh, rolling her eyes, as if the papers were a complete annoyance. She told me that the country club had just emailed her some last-minute vendor liability forms. She explained that because I was the primary financial guarantor for the wedding, the venue needed my signature on a supplemental insurance waiver. She lied with such breathtaking ease, claiming the paperwork was just a standard formality to protect my personal assets in case a guest drank too much champagne and injured themselves on the dance floor. She smoothed the papers out on my desk and pulled a silver pen from her pocket, holding it out to me. She pointed to a line at the very bottom of the page marked with a yellow sticky note. She told me she just needed my quick signature so she could scan it and send it back to the event coordinator before the office closed. I took the silver pen from her hand. I looked down at the stack of papers. She had placed a generic-looking cover letter on top, featuring the stolen logo of the country club. But I did not just look at the signature line. I moved my thumb and slowly peeled back the top page to read the dense legal paragraphs printed underneath. The font was entirely different. The legal terminology had absolutely nothing to do with catering liability or injured wedding guests. I scanned the first few sentences and immediately recognized the brutal, unforgiving language of a durable power of attorney. She had hidden the financial surrender documents right underneath a fake country club letterhead. I kept reading, my eyes moving quickly across the page while my face remained perfectly blank. I saw clauses granting her absolute fiduciary control over my bank accounts, my retirement funds, and my real estate properties. I saw the specific medical proxy paragraph that would grant her the legal authority to commit me to a full-time care facility against my will. This was the final piece of her puzzle. She knew that forging my signature on the bank loan was a massive risk. She wanted my actual physical signature on these legal documents so she could walk into family court on Monday morning and permanently strip away my human rights with absolute legal immunity. The sheer audacity of her evil was almost magnificent. She was standing in my office feeding me roasted chicken and rubbing my shoulders while casually asking me to sign my own death warrant. She thought my old age had made me blind to legal jargon. She thought I would simply blindly trust my loving wife and sign wherever she pointed. I looked up from the papers. Diane was watching me closely, a tiny fraction of nervousness finally leaking into her perfect facade. She asked me if something was wrong with the insurance waiver, urging me to just sign it quickly so my dinner would not get cold. I looked at the silver pen in my hand. I knew that if I refused to sign, she would realize I was onto her scheme. She would panic, and she might try to accelerate the fraudulent psychiatric petition before I could finalize my escape. I needed to maintain the illusion of my complete compliance for just a little while longer. I needed to sign the papers, but I was not going to give her what she wanted. I smiled warmly at my wife, thanking her for taking care of the boring administrative details. I lowered the pen toward the paper, preparing to execute a legally devastating maneuver right in front of her eyes. I looked at Diane. Her eyes were completely focused on the silver pen in my hand. I could see the tiny pulse of anticipation beating in her throat. She was waiting for the final piece of her fraudulent empire to lock into place. I positioned the pen over the signature line on the fraudulent power of attorney document, but I did not immediately sign it. Instead, I paused, letting the silence stretch out for a few agonizing seconds. I looked up at her and told her that my hands were feeling a bit stiff lately from all the gardening. I told her I hoped my signature would not look too messy. She let out a nervous little laugh, quickly waving her hand and telling me not to worry about it. She said the event coordinator at the country club was very understanding, and that as long as there was some kind of ink on the paper, it would be perfectly fine. I smiled. She had just given me verbal confirmation that she did not care what the signature looked like as long as she saw me write it. I lowered the pen again. For 40 years as a structural engineer, I had signed thousands of legally binding architectural blueprints. My official signature was a highly distinctive, highly complex script that I had cultivated over decades. It was practically impossible to forge accurately, which was why Diane's attempt on the bank loan application was a decent effort, but still flawed to a trained eye. My real signature was currently locked securely in the bank records in my attorney files and on the deed to my house. But as I pressed the silver pen against her fraudulent medical proxy document, I did not use my real signature. I did not even attempt to write my own name. Instead, I engaged in a calculated act of legal sabotage. I grasped the pen awkwardly, using my index and middle fingers to change the pressure and angle of the ink flow. I slowly scrawled out a completely illegible, chaotic series of loops and jagged lines. It looked like the handwriting of a child or someone suffering from a severe neurological tremor. It looked absolutely nothing like the precise engineered script I used on every other legal document in my life. Furthermore, I did not sign Robert Stanton. In the chaotic mess of ink, I deliberately spelled out the name Richard Stanford. I finished the disastrous scrawl and handed the silver pen back to Diane. I sat back in my chair, letting out a heavy, exaggerated sigh. I told her I was sorry it was so messy, but that my arthritis was really acting up today. Diane snatched the paper off the desk, her eyes immediately darting down to the signature line. She saw the jagged, illegible ink. For a second, a flash of annoyance crossed her face, but it was quickly replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated relief. She did not care that it was illegible. She did not even realize I had signed the wrong name. All she saw was the legal completion of her trap. In her mind, she was now holding the skeleton key to my entire life. She quickly folded the document and shoved it back into the pocket of her cashmere sweater. She practically beamed at me, her face glowing with the arrogant confidence of someone who believes they have just committed the perfect crime. She leaned over the desk and kissed me lightly on the cheek. Her perfume smelled heavy and cloying. She told me I was a good husband. She told me I had just saved the wedding. She picked up the empty silver tray and practically skipped out of my office, closing the door softly behind her. I sat alone in the quiet room, listening to her footsteps fade down the hallway. The masterstroke was complete. She thought she had won. She thought she possessed a legally binding, durable power of attorney. But what she actually possessed was a completely worthless piece of paper. If she ever tried to present that document to a bank, a hospital, or a family court judge, it would immediately trigger a massive fraud investigation. The signature on that paper would not match a single piece of identification or financial record I possessed. It was the ultimate poison pill. When she finally tried to use it, the document would violently detonate in her hands, destroying whatever remaining credibility she had left. I looked at the roasted chicken cooling on my desk. I picked up the plate and calmly scraped the entire meal directly into the garbage can. The game of compliance was officially over. Friday morning broke with a clear blue sky. I sat at the kitchen island drinking my black coffee while Diane hummed a cheerful tune by the stove. She was in a spectacularly good mood. In her mind, she was holding the ultimate trump card. She believed the fraudulent power of attorney resting in her purse gave her complete dominion over my life. She was already talking about the luxurious spa weekend she and Brittany were leaving for this afternoon. They had booked expensive massages and facials using her maxed-out credit cards to relax before the big wedding on Saturday. I simply nodded and told her to enjoy herself. I watched her walk upstairs to pack her designer luggage, entirely unaware that she was preparing to leave a house she would never legally enter again. I rinsed my coffee mug, placed it in the dishwasher, and walked out to my truck. I drove back into the city, to the towering glass building where Vincent Gallagher orchestrated his legal warfare. I bypassed the receptionist and walked directly into his private suite. Vincent was already sitting at the head of his massive conference table. Spread out before him was a perfectly organized array of thick legal documents printed on heavy archival paper. He did not offer a polite morning greeting. He simply pointed to the leather chair next to him, indicating that the final phase of the demolition was ready to commence. I sat down and looked at the top document. It was a formal quitclaim deed. This was the exact legal instrument required to permanently sever my ownership of the property. Vincent folded his hands over the table and explained the exact nature of the entity purchasing the home. I had instructed him to find a buyer that would show absolutely zero mercy to unauthorized occupants. Vincent had delivered perfectly. He had brokered the transfer to a blind corporate trust managed by a notoriously aggressive commercial property firm. This was not a friendly local landlord who might listen to a sob story or grant an extension out of pity. This was a faceless billion-dollar corporation with a dedicated team of ruthless eviction attorneys. They viewed residential properties strictly as numbers on a balance sheet. Vincent explained, the moment the title transferred, this corporation would treat anyone remaining inside the structure as hostile trespassers. Vincent pushed the quitclaim deed across the polished mahogany table. He handed me a heavy gold fountain pen. I held the pen in my hand and looked down at the signature line. This was the most significant signature of my entire life. 25 years ago, I had stood on an empty plot of dirt and envisioned the perfect home. I had drafted the blueprints, calculated the load-bearing walls, and poured the foundation with my own sweat. I had built that house to last a century, expecting it to be the quiet sanctuary of my old age. But a structure is only as strong as the people living inside it. Diane and Brittany had infected the foundation with their greed. They had turned my sanctuary into a trap. I realized that keeping the physical building was no longer a victory. True victory was walking away clean and letting the roof collapse directly onto their heads. I pressed the gold nib of the pen against the thick paper. Unlike the chaotic scribbled mess I had given Diane the night before, I now executed my true signature. The ink flowed smoothly, forming the precise engineered letters of my actual name. I signed the first page. I turned to the next page and signed again. I methodically moved through the stack of documents, legally transferring the deed, the property rights, and the absolute ownership of the $1.2 million estate to the corporate trust. With every stroke of the pen, I felt a massive weight lifting from my shoulders. I was no longer a homeowner tethered to a corrupted property. I was completely unburdened. Vincent gathered the signed pages and placed his official notary seal on the bottom of the final sheet. The heavy stamp echoed in the quiet conference room. He looked at me and confirmed that the house was officially gone. He told me he had a courier waiting in the lobby to physically deliver the documents to the county clerk office for immediate recording. By noon today, the public records would reflect the corporate trust as the sole legal owner of the property. But there was one final crucial detail to finalize. Vincent slid a thinner document across the table. It was a temporary commercial lease-back agreement. Because the wedding was tomorrow, and Diane still believed she controlled the property, I needed legal cover to remain on the premises for just a few more days. I signed the lease-back agreement, officially making myself a temporary rent-paying tenant in the house I had built. The terms were brutally strict. The lease expired exactly at midnight on Sunday. At that precise moment, my legal right to occupy the property would vanish, and the corporate management group would assume absolute physical control. Vincent leaned back in his chair, his eyes gleaming with cold professional admiration. He mapped out the timeline of the impending destruction. He noted that Diane had scheduled her fraudulent bank appraisal for this very afternoon. A representative from the bank was going to arrive at the house to evaluate the property for her $300,000 home equity loan. But when the bank underwriter ran the final title search on Monday morning, they would discover that the house no longer belonged to Robert Stanton. They would find the corporate trust on the deed. The fraudulent loan application would instantly flag as a massive federal crime, and the bank would immediately freeze every account associated with Diane's name. Furthermore, when Diane and Brittany returned from their failed wedding on Saturday, they would be walking into a house owned by a hostile corporation. By Monday morning, the property management group would dispatch their legal team to execute a forced commercial eviction. Diane would try to produce her fake power of attorney, but it would be utterly useless against a corporate entity that already held the absolute legal deed to the land. She would have no house, no loan, no husband, and no legal standing whatsoever. I thanked Vincent for his flawless execution. I told him I would contact him on Monday morning to finalize the filing of the divorce petition. I stood up from the conference table feeling lighter and more powerful than I had in 20 years. The trap was not just set. The steel jaws were completely locked into place. I walked out of the law office and stepped into the bustling city street. I had to return to the house one last time. I had a safe to empty and bags to pack before the women left for their luxurious weekend. I was ready to leave them the empty shell of a life they had so desperately tried to steal. Friday afternoon arrived exactly as Diane had planned. The driveway was filled with the sound of expensive luggage wheels rolling across the pavement. I stood near the kitchen island, watching the three of them prepare for their luxurious spa weekend. Diane was dressed in crisp white linen, talking loudly on her phone to a concierge about reserving a private cabana by the mineral pool. Brittany and Chad were already sitting inside Chad's leased luxury vehicle, complaining to each other about how exhausting the wedding preparations had been over the past few weeks. They were leaving for 2 full days of premium deep tissue massages, thermal mineral baths, and 5-star dining experiences. Diane had booked the entire extravagant weekend using a series of hidden credit cards that I knew were already pushed to their absolute limits. She was financing her relaxation with phantom money, believing with complete certainty that by Monday morning, the massive fraudulent home equity loan would miraculously wipe all her secret debts clean. She ended her phone call and walked over to where I was standing. She gave me a condescending smile, smoothing her linen jacket, and told me to make sure the house was completely spotless before they returned on Saturday morning for the final wedding prep. She reminded me to stay out of the way of the makeup artists and keep my messy gardening boots locked in the garage. I simply nodded, keeping my expression perfectly blank, and wished her a very relaxing weekend. She turned around, walked out the front door without looking back, and slid into the passenger seat of the waiting car. I stood by the large bay window and watched Chad back the expensive vehicle out of the driveway. They were laughing and taking pictures with their phones, completely intoxicated by their own perceived brilliance. I watched the car disappear down the street until the entire neighborhood was completely quiet. The moment the sound of their engine faded away, the atmosphere inside the house completely changed. It was no longer a domestic battleground filled with tension and fake smiles. It was simply an empty building owned by a corporate trust. I did not waste a single second of the time they had just given me. I walked directly down the hallway into my office and firmly locked the door behind me. I knelt down in front of the heavy steel safe that was permanently bolted to the floor beneath my mahogany desk. I spun the combination dial perfectly, aligning the numbers I had memorized decades ago, and pulled the heavy door open. Inside rested the true foundation of my life. I reached in and pulled out a stack of leather-bound architectural journals containing decades of my original commercial bridge designs. I carefully placed them into a heavy canvas duffel bag, feeling the satisfying weight of my life work. Next, I removed the small velvet box containing the antique silver pocket watch my grandfather had brought over from Europe. Then came the physical stock certificates, the offshore banking tokens, and the highly encrypted hard drives that held the keys to a financial empire Diane could not even begin to comprehend. I packed everything with the methodical precision of a seasoned engineer preparing a site for a massive, controlled demolition. I left absolutely nothing behind that held any true sentimental or financial value. Once the safe was completely empty and locked back into place, I moved upstairs to the master bedroom. I did not pack any of the expensive tailored suits Diane had bought for me over the years to make me look presentable to her wealthy friends. I left them hanging perfectly straight in the custom closet like discarded costumes from a terrible, tragic play. I only packed my comfortable work clothes, my heavy denim jeans, my flannel shirts, and my worn leather boots. I packed my shaving kit and a few basic necessary toiletries into a small leather overnight bag. I carried my 2 bags downstairs and placed them neatly by the front door. Then I took a final deliberate walk through the massive estate. I walked through the formal dining room, staring at the imported crystal chandelier that cost more than most people earned in a year. I walked through the custom chef kitchen, tracing my hand along the premium granite countertops I had personally selected when I built the house. I walked past the velvet sofa where Diane had sat sipping her wine while her daughter insulted my entire existence. I felt absolutely no emotional attachment to any of the furniture or the expensive decorations surrounding me. They were just objects taking up space in a corporate asset. Diane and Brittany valued the appearance of wealth. They valued the aesthetic of a luxury life without ever understanding the discipline and sacrifice required to actually build it. I was leaving them with a beautiful house full of expensive things that they legally no longer owned. The silence of the house was absolute and incredibly peaceful. I walked back into my office for one final critical task. I needed to ensure there was absolutely no confusion when they returned tomorrow morning. I sat down at my desk and pulled out a fresh, heavy manila folder. This folder was the exact mechanism that would deliver their reality check. I opened the folder and placed the signed zero liability cancellation documents from the country club right on top. Beneath that, I placed a copy of the legal notice from the photography company and the florist confirming that all services were permanently voided. Then I added a copy of the fraudulent power of attorney document, complete with the ridiculous illegible signature and the fake name I had written, so Diane could see exactly how her brilliant legal trap had failed. Next, I placed a formal notice of immediate eviction printed on the heavy embossed letterhead of the corporate property management group. The notice clearly stated that the property had changed ownership and that any unauthorized persons remaining on the premises after midnight on Sunday would be forcibly removed by armed law enforcement. Finally, at the very bottom of the stack, I placed the sealed divorce petition, officially citing her massive financial fraud. I closed the manila folder and carried it out of the office. I walked into the center of the kitchen and placed the folder perfectly square in the middle of the pristine marble island. It was the only object left on the massive counter. It was the absolute focal point of the room. When they walked through the door on Saturday morning, expecting to put on their designer dresses and drink imported champagne, this single devastating folder would be waiting for them. It was a perfectly engineered bomb of mathematical justice. I looked at the folder one last time, verifying that its placement was completely unavoidable. Then I picked up my canvas duffel bag and my leather overnight bag. I walked out the front door and stepped into the warm afternoon sun. I pulled the heavy oak door shut behind me, listening to the deadbolt click into place for the very last time. I did not look back at the house. I loaded my bags into the back of my truck, climbed into the driver's seat, and started the engine. I put the truck in gear and drove away from the neighborhood, leaving my past completely behind me. The move out was officially complete, and the trap was perfectly primed to snap shut. Saturday morning arrived with a brilliant golden sunrise. The house was entirely silent. It was no longer a family home filled with memories or warmth. It was a sterile financial asset, owned by a faceless corporate entity, just waiting to be cleared of its unauthorized occupants. The early morning light poured through the large bay windows, illuminating the pristine white marble island in the center of the kitchen. There were no coffee cups left in the sink. There was no smell of breakfast cooking. The expensive espresso machine was turned off and cold. The only thing occupying the massive empty space was the heavy manila folder I had placed perfectly square in the center of the counter the day before. It was a quiet, unassuming object, but it held the explosive power to completely obliterate 2 lives. The trap had been resting there all night undisturbed and ready to detonate. At exactly 9 in the morning, the heavy oak front door swung open. The absolute peace of the morning was instantly shattered by the loud, shrill voices of Diane and Brittany returning from their luxury spa weekend. Their high heels clicked aggressively against the hardwood floors, echoing through the empty hallways. Diane called out my name, her voice dripping with that familiar condescending authority. She demanded to know if I had stayed completely out of the way, and if I had brewed a fresh pot of premium coffee for the professional makeup artists who were arriving in less than an hour. Brittany marched in right behind her, loudly complaining about the morning humidity and stressing over the exact fit of her designer reception dress. They walked straight down the hall and marched into the kitchen, expecting to find me standing there, ready to serve their every need. Instead, they found absolute, total emptiness. Diane stopped abruptly, in the center of the room, her eyes scanning the perfectly clean counters. She immediately noticed the profound, unnatural silence of the house. It was not just quiet, it felt completely hollowed out. There was no sound of the television, no sound of footsteps upstairs. Then her gaze landed on the single manila folder, resting alone on the marble island. She walked over to it with a look of mild annoyance, clearly assuming it was just some last-minute vendor invoices I had stupidly forgotten to file away. She reached out and flipped the heavy cover open. I was not physically there to witness her reaction, but the mathematics of the moment were undeniable. She would look down and see the voided country club contracts, first realizing instantly that the luxury venue was permanently locked. She would frantically push those aside, only to find her own fraudulent power of attorney document staring back at her, completely invalidated by the fake name I had deliberately scribbled across the bottom. The panic would rise in her chest as she uncovered the formal corporate eviction notice informing her that the ground she was standing on no longer belonged to her, and that armed authorities would remove her by tomorrow night. And finally, resting at the very bottom of the stack, the heavily sealed divorce petition would confirm her absolute and total ruin. The arrogant smiles they had worn just seconds ago would melt into pure, suffocating terror as the reality of their complete destruction finally locked them inside its steel jaws. The drive from the empty house to the country club was a suffocating nightmare of denial. Diane gripped the leather steering wheel of her luxury sedan, with white knuckles, her breathing shallow and erratic. She had seen the devastating manila folder resting on the kitchen island. She had seen the voided contracts, the fraudulent power of attorney, and the corporate eviction notice. But her narcissistic mind simply refused to process the mathematical reality of her destruction. She convinced herself and her panicking daughter that it was all just an elaborate bluff. She told Brittany that Robert was a weak old man who did not possess the courage to actually cancel a $60,000 luxury wedding. They sped down the highway, leaving the empty corporate-owned house behind them, praying that the grand ballroom would be perfectly decorated and waiting for their arrival. They pulled into the long, winding driveway of the Oakwood Valley Country Club, expecting to see a line of eager valets holding silver trays of champagne. Instead, they were greeted by a massive, chaotic traffic jam of idling luxury vehicles. Over 200 guests, dressed in their absolute finest silk suits and designer gowns, were wandering aimlessly around the hot, paved driveway. They looked incredibly confused, checking their expensive watches and whispering to one another. The massive wrought iron gates that served as the grand entrance to the club were pulled completely shut. A thick, heavy steel chain was wrapped multiple times around the center bars, secured by a massive brass padlock. There were no valets. There were no imported white orchids. There was only a profound, embarrassing barrier, keeping the entire wedding party standing in the dirt. Chad was standing near the front of the crowd, wearing a custom-tailored tuxedo that he had purchased using Diane's stolen funds. He was aggressively yelling into his cell phone, his face bright red with furious indignation. Several of his wealthy tech investors, the very people he had invited to witness his ascension into high society, were standing nearby looking deeply annoyed by the entire spectacle. Diane slammed her car into park and practically fell out the door. She was wearing a ridiculous oversized hat and a sequined mother-of-the-bride dress that suddenly looked incredibly cheap and foolish in the harsh glare of the morning sun. Brittany struggled to escape the passenger seat, her massive, heavy silk train dragging across the oily asphalt and picking up dirt with every step. Chad marched directly over to them the moment he saw their car. He did not ask how they were doing. He angrily demanded to know why his extremely important business contacts were currently sweating in a parking lot instead of drinking premium cocktails in an air-conditioned ballroom. Diane ignored him completely, pushing her way blindly through the thick crowd of confused and frustrated guests. She marched straight up to the locked iron gates and grabbed the heavy metal bars, violently shaking them in a desperate display of entitlement. She began screaming for someone to open the doors, demanding to speak to the senior event director immediately. The entire crowd of 200 guests stopped talking and turned to watch the mother of the bride having a complete public meltdown. A small, heavy wooden door near the stone guardhouse slowly opened, and Mr. Montgomery stepped out into the sunlight. He was wearing his pristine, tailored suit, holding a sleek leather clipboard. He did not look rushed, and he certainly did not look apologetic. He walked with a slow, deliberate pace, stopping just on the other side of the iron bars. He looked at Diane, gripping the metal like a trapped animal, and his expression was one of complete professional disdain. Diane ordered him to unlock the gate right that very second, claiming there had been a massive administrative mistake. She pointed a shaking finger at Brittany, who was crying in her dirty dress, and told him he was ruining a high-society luxury wedding. Montgomery did not lower his voice to protect her dignity. He spoke loudly and clearly, projecting his voice so that every single guest standing in the quiet parking lot could hear his exact words. He informed Diane that there was absolutely no mistake. He stated that the primary financial guarantor of the event had formally invoked the zero liability cancellation clause in person on Thursday morning. He announced to the crowd that the entire event was permanently voided due to a complete withdrawal of all financial authorization and severe non-payment. The words echoed across the asphalt, hitting Diane like a physical blow. The color drained completely from Diane's face, leaving her a sickening shade of pale gray. She stammered wildly, trying to tell him she would simply pay for the entire wedding herself, right there on the spot. She dug frantically into her designer purse and pulled out her shiny platinum credit card, shoving it through the gaps in the iron bars. She begged him to just swipe the card and open the doors. Montgomery looked at the piece of plastic and then looked back up at her face. He raised his voice even louder, addressing the entire audience. He announced that her specific credit card was already flagged by their merchant banking system as completely maxed out and currently associated with an active federal bank fraud investigation. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd of 200 guests. The wealthy investors Chad had been trying so desperately to impress began shaking their heads in absolute disgust and walking back to their cars. Brittany let out a loud, hysterical sob, dropping to her knees right there on the dirty parking lot asphalt. Her perfect aesthetic was completely eradicated. Chad stared at the weeping bride and the publicly humiliated mother-in-law. In that exact moment, he realized the horrific truth. The endless money was gone, the luxury house was gone, and the entire facade of their superior wealth was a complete fabricated lie. He took a slow, deliberate step backward, his face hardening into a cold mask of pure selfish survival. He turned his back on his crying fiancée and walked away. The public execution of their social standing was absolute, mathematically precise, and completely irreversible. Diane fled the country club parking lot like a thief escaping a burning building. She left her weeping daughter on the asphalt and practically threw herself into the driver's seat of her car. Her hands were shaking so violently she could barely put the vehicle into gear. The public humiliation was burning a hole through her chest, but the sheer terror of her financial reality was beginning to set in. She needed to find Robert immediately. She grabbed her cell phone and opened the family location tracking application. She had secretly installed it on his phone months ago to monitor his daily movements while she planned her fraudulent takeover. She expected the map to show a small flashing dot at a cheap roadside motel or a dingy local diner. She expected to find him sitting in a dark room, regretting his terrible mistake and crying over the family he had just destroyed. She fully intended to kick the door down, scream in his face, and force him to call the country club to fix everything. She stared at the digital map on her screen. The flashing dot was not at a cheap motel. It was located right in the heart of the downtown financial district. She slammed her foot on the gas pedal, speeding toward the city center with reckless desperation. Her oversized mother-of-the-bride hat was sitting crooked on her head, and her expensive sequined dress was stained with sweat and parking lot dirt. She did not care how she looked. She only cared about asserting her dominance and taking back control of her stolen future. She pulled up to the address on the map and slammed on the brakes. She looked out the window, and her confusion instantly multiplied. She was parked in front of the most exclusive premium steakhouse in the entire city. It was a notoriously expensive restaurant where politicians and wealthy executives conducted million-dollar deals over dry-aged beef and imported wine. Diane stormed out of her car and marched toward the heavy brass doors of the restaurant. The valet tried to stop her, but she pushed right past him. She burst into the quiet, dimly lit dining room. The air inside smelled of rich, roasted garlic, charred oak, and expensive cologne. The atmosphere was incredibly hushed and respectful, a stark contrast to the screaming chaos she had just left behind at the country club. She ignored the shocked expression of the maitre d' and frantically scanned the room. Her eyes darted past tables of men in tailored suits and women in elegant dresses. Then she saw him. Robert was sitting in a large, private, circular leather booth tucked away in the back corner of the restaurant. He was not crying. He was not shaking. He was not looking at his phone waiting for her angry call. He was sitting with perfect posture, radiating an aura of absolute untouchable calm. He was wearing a crisp, pressed shirt and a tailored blazer, looking more distinguished and powerful than she had ever seen him. Sitting directly across from him was Vincent Gallagher, his ruthless estate attorney. The table between them was covered in a pristine white linen tablecloth. In the center of the table rested two heavy crystal glasses of premium scotch and two massive, perfectly seared, dry-aged steaks. They were not plotting. They were celebrating. Diane felt a cold wave of absolute dread wash over her body. The illusion she had maintained for 20 years completely shattered in that exact second. Robert had not acted out of sudden emotional panic. He had executed a flawless, premeditated strike, and he was currently enjoying a victory lunch. Her breathing became shallow and ragged as she marched across the dining room floor. The heavy sequins of her dress rustled aggressively, drawing annoyed glances from the wealthy patrons around her. She did not care. She reached their private booth and violently slammed both of her hands down onto the polished mahogany table. The silverware rattled, but neither Robert nor Vincent even flinched. She stood over them, her chest heaving, trying to summon the hateful, authoritative voice she had used in the living room just a few days ago. She wanted to scream. She wanted to demand answers. But the sheer terror choking her throat made it impossible to speak. Robert did not look startled. He did not look angry. He slowly placed his silver fork down onto his porcelain plate. He picked up his white linen napkin and carefully dabbed the corners of his mouth. He looked up at Diane with an expression of mild, polite curiosity, as if a stranger had just interrupted a very pleasant conversation. Vincent simply leaned back in his heavy leather chair, took a slow sip of his expensive scotch, and smiled a cold, predatory smile. The power dynamic in the room was absolute. Diane was standing there covered in dirt and humiliation, completely powerless, while the man she had tried to destroy sat comfortably in his leather booth, holding all the remaining cards. Diane stood trembling in front of the mahogany table. A moment later, the heavy brass doors of the restaurant flew open again. Chad marched inside, dragging a sobbing Brittany by the wrist. He had followed the car Diane was driving across the city, demanding to know who was going to pay the furious vendors waiting in the country club parking lot. He stormed up to our table, glaring at me as if I were a disobedient employee. He slammed his fist down next to Diane and loudly demanded that I immediately transfer $60,000 into his personal account to fix the massive mess I had created. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my ice water. I looked up at the three of them standing there in their ruined wedding clothes, looking like a trio of absolute fools. I spoke in a quiet, measured tone, forcing them to lean in to hear me over the low hum of the upscale restaurant. I told Diane she should never have forged my signature on a federal bank loan application. The remaining color drained completely from her face. I told her the $300,000 home equity loan she applied for was permanently canceled because as of yesterday morning, I no longer owned the house. I watched the exact moment her brain tried to process the mathematical reality of her destruction. I explained that I had legally transferred the deed of the $1.2 million estate to a blind corporate trust. I told her that by Monday morning, the bank underwriter would discover the fraudulent application, and all of her secret credit cards would be frozen, pending a federal fraud investigation. I told her the corporate property management group was sending an armed eviction team to the house at midnight on Sunday. I made it absolutely clear that if she or her daughter were still inside that structure, they would be forcefully arrested for criminal trespassing. Diane began to hyperventilate. She reached frantically into her purse and pulled out the folded power of attorney document, waving it wildly in the air. She screamed that she had legal control over my assets and that a family court judge would force me to reverse everything. Vincent Gallagher let out a low, sharp laugh. He leaned forward and told her to actually read the signature at the bottom of the page. She stared at the chaotic ink and the completely fake name I had written. I told her that submitting a fraudulently signed legal document with a fake name to a judge carries a mandatory prison sentence. She dropped the paper onto the table as if it were actively burning her fingers. Chad had been standing perfectly still, listening to every single word. His eyes darted from the voided legal document to the terrified face of his future mother-in-law. The absolute financial reality of the situation washed over him like freezing water. There was no $300,000 loan. There was no $1 million house for him to live in. There was absolutely zero inheritance. He was marrying into a family with nothing but massive hidden debt and impending felony charges. He looked down at Brittany, who was clutching his arm and weeping uncontrollably. He forcefully peeled her fingers off his tailored tuxedo jacket. He took a massive, deliberate step backward. He looked at Diane and called her a delusional parasite. He looked at Brittany and told her the wedding was permanently canceled and that he never wanted to see her again. He turned around and walked out of the restaurant, without looking back, leaving Brittany screaming his name and collapsing onto the floor of the expensive dining room. I picked up my steak knife and calmly cut another piece of dry aged beef. The execution was complete. 6 months have passed since the morning the iron gates of the country club locked them out of their own fantasy. The seasons have changed, and so has the fundamental reality of their existence. The corporate property management group did exactly what they promised. On that Sunday night, armed deputies arrived at my former home and physically escorted Diane and Brittany off the property. They were allowed to take only what they could carry in their hands. Everything else they valued, the designer furniture, the expensive art, the illusion of their massive wealth, was legally seized. Today, Diane lives in a cramped one-bedroom apartment situated directly above a noisy 24-hour laundromat on the absolute worst side of the city. She no longer wears crisp white linen or drinks imported wine on a velvet sofa. Her days are consumed by the relentless, terrifying ringing of her telephone. The federal fraud investigation triggered by her forged home equity application did not result in immediate prison time, but it completely decimated her financial identity. The bank permanently froze every single account attached to her name. The hidden credit cards she used to fund her luxurious spa weekend and her expensive lifestyle were called in for immediate collection with crippling penalty interest rates. She is drowning in a mountain of debt so massive she will never climb out from under it. She is forced to work as a receptionist at a low-end used car dealership, answering phones for minimum wage, just to keep the electricity turned on in her miserable apartment. She spends her lunch breaks hiding in her rusted compact car, crying over the life she threw away. Brittany suffered a fate perfectly designed for a woman who valued superficial aesthetics over basic human decency. Chad never spoke to her again after walking out of the premium steakhouse. He immediately blocked her number and moved across the country to seek out a new wealthy family to parasitize. Without his fake tech money and without my financial backing, Brittany was left holding the bag for all the extravagant secondary wedding expenses she had aggressively placed on her own personal credit cards. The custom champagne fountain, the imported silk drapery, and the 2 designer dresses she had ordered strictly for the reception were all completely non-refundable. To avoid facing total bankruptcy, she was forced to abandon her dreams of high society leisure. She now works 2 grueling retail jobs just to make the minimum monthly payments on her massive debt. She spends her mornings folding cheap clothes at a discount department store and her evenings standing behind the register of a local grocery store. Her perfectly manicured hands are now cracked and calloused from breaking down heavy cardboard boxes. The wealthy friends she had invited to her luxury wedding completely abandoned her, treating her like a contagious disease the moment her social status evaporated. She occasionally sees them walking into the grocery store where she works, and she is forced to lower her head and scan their premium items. She spends her nights sleeping on a cheap pull-out couch in her mother-tiny apartment, staring at the water-stained ceiling and realizing that she traded a lifetime of unconditional love and security for a single day of arrogant cruelty that she never even got to experience. Their final desperate attempt to reclaim their stolen kingdom happened 3 months ago. Fueled by absolute delusion, Diane and Brittany managed to find a desperate amateur lawyer willing to file a civil lawsuit against me. They attempted to sue me for emotional distress breach of verbal contract and the financial costs of the ruined wedding. They honestly believed they could stand in front of a judge, cry a few tears, and force me to open my wallet one last time. I did not even bother attending the hearing. I stayed at my new home drinking my morning coffee while Vincent Gallagher walked into the courtroom entirely alone. Vincent did not argue with their lawyer. He did not raise his voice or object. He simply walked up to the judge bench and placed 3 pieces of paper on the wood. He presented the legally binding zero liability cancellation clause I had signed at the country club. He presented the corporate deed proving I did not own the house when they were evicted. And finally, he presented the fraudulent power of attorney document featuring the illegible signature and the completely fake name. The civil hearing lasted exactly 9 minutes. The judge took one look at the fraudulent medical proxy, and his face turned bright red with fury. He looked down at Diane and threatened to have her arrested for perjury and criminal fraud right there in his courtroom if she ever filed another piece of paper in his jurisdiction. The lawsuit was immediately dismissed with extreme prejudice. Vincent then calmly requested and was instantly granted a permanent and absolute restraining order against both of them. They are legally barred from contacting me, approaching me, or ever attempting to find me for the rest of their miserable lives. The steel trap had not just closed around them, it had been completely welded shut forever. The morning air up here in the mountains is crisp and completely still. There are no sirens, no loud cars, and absolutely no entitled voices demanding my attention. I sit on the heavy wooden deck of my new cabin, watching the sun rise over the dense pine trees. My hands are wrapped around a ceramic mug of hot black coffee. The steam rises into the cold morning air. I take a slow, deliberate sip, tasting the rich, bitter warmth. It is the best cup of coffee I have ever had because I am drinking it in absolute total peace. The cancer has been completely surgically removed from my life. I do not wonder what Diane is doing at the used car dealership. I do not care how many cardboard boxes Brittany has to fold at her discount retail jobs. They are ghosts haunting a past that no longer exists. I finish my coffee and walk back inside the cabin. The interior is simple, clean, and built with incredible structural integrity. I walk over to my large drafting table positioned right in front of a massive glass window overlooking the valley. Spread out across the smooth wooden surface are the preliminary blueprints for a new local community center. The nearby town council needed an experienced structural engineers to design a safe gathering place for their youth programs, but they had absolutely no budget to hire a professional firm. I offered to design the entire building completely pro bono. For the first time in 20 years, I am using my skills and my passion to build something that will actually nurture people. I am not building a bank account for a parasite. I am building a strong foundation for a community that actually respects my time and my expertise. I pick up my drafting pencil and draw a perfectly straight line across the heavy paper. The graphite scratches softly against the surface. It is a beautiful, productive sound. People often believe that walking away from a 20-year marriage is a massive tragedy. They believe that growing old alone in a mountain cabin is a lonely, sad existence. But they do not understand the profound difference between being alone and being free. Loneliness is sitting in a crowded living room, listening to the woman you love agree that you are entirely worthless. Freedom is sitting in an empty room, knowing that every single person in your life genuinely respects you, even if that means the room is completely empty. I have learned that the concept of family is not an obligation forged by marriage certificates or decades spent living under the exact same roof. True family is an architecture built entirely on the unbreakable foundation of mutual respect and absolute boundaries. If a bridge is rotting from the inside, you do not stand on it and hope it holds your weight. You step off, you tear it down, and you build a completely new one. I lost a deceitful wife and a cruel stepdaughter, but I gained the absolute sovereignty of my own existence. I am 71 years old, and I have never felt more alive, more powerful, or more completely at peace. I look out the window at the endless mountain range stretching toward the horizon. I have my health, I have my absolute dignity, and I have my quiet mornings. The story of Robert Stanton did not end in a miserable state-funded psychiatric ward. It ended exactly where it was always supposed to end. Right here in the quiet mountains, holding a pencil and drawing a completely new, beautiful line. If this story resonated with you, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share in the comments how you have successfully removed toxic people from your own life.